It was a quiet, almost eerie night on a deserted stretch of rural road. The kind of silence that could make even the most seasoned officer feel a sense of unease. Officer Daniel Harris, nearing the end of his shift, sat in his cruiser, the low hum of the engine the only sound breaking the stillness. His eyes were heavy from a long day, his thoughts drifting as he watched the occasional car pass by. It was a typical night, uneventful, save for the occasional radio crackle or brief call from dispatch. But tonight, something was different. As Daniel's cruiser coasted down the road, he noticed a faint flicker of red in the distance. A beat-up pickup truck, its tail lights blinking erratically. The truck swerved slightly, its rear tires straying over the center line before the driver quickly corrected. Something about the way the vehicle moved seemed off. The left tail light was completely out, and the vehicle appeared to struggle with its steering. It wasn't much, but it was enough to warrant a stop. Daniel flicked on his siren, the red and blue lights slicing through the darkness, casting long shadows across the empty road. The truck hesitated before slowly pulling to the shoulder. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his instincts kicking in. As a seasoned officer, he knew that a vehicle in this condition could be hiding more than just mechanical issues. He parked his cruiser a few feet behind the truck and grabbed his flashlight. Stepping out into the cool night air, the gravel crunched under his boots. The sound sharpened the stillness. His mind raced with questions. Was it a simple mechanical failure? Or was there something more? It was time to find out. Daniel approached the truck cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the night. The vehicle was old, worn down, and covered in rust. The tailgate had deep scratches, as though it had scraped along rough surfaces, and there was a dark, thick stain smeared unevenly across the rear. It could have been mud, but something about it didn't sit right with him. The truck looked like it had seen better days. And yet, there was something more, something that wasn't immediately visible. As he reached the driver's side window, Daniel noticed the man inside, Clint Miller. The driver appeared anxious, his eyes flicking around nervously, as if he were hiding something. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the knuckles turned white. Daniel didn't buy the man's calm demeanor, despite the forced smile he offered. His instincts were telling him there was more to this than a simple traffic violation. "Evening, sir," Daniel said, keeping his tone calm but firm, trying to put the driver at ease while assessing the situation. "You were swerving back there. Everything okay?" Clint, a man in his 40s, quickly responded, Yeah, sorry about that. Long shift at the factory. Just trying to get home." Daniel nodded, scanning the man's face for any signs of stress or deception. It wasn't uncommon for people to be tired, especially after long hours at a factory. But there was something about Clint's voice, the hesitation, the slight tremor in his words, that caught Daniel's attention. "What factory is that?" Daniel asked, his eyes narrowing as he watched Clint's eyes flick to the rearview mirror before quickly returning to him. "The one out by Ridgefield," Clint replied after a brief pause. His eyes darted to the mirror again, this time more noticeable. "We've been working late hours. Real killer." Daniel's suspicion grew. The story sounded plausible, but it didn't explain the way Clint's body language shifted, as if he were trying to avoid something. The truck's interior wasn't much better, either. The passenger seat was covered in fast food wrappers, empty cans, and a general sense of neglect. It looked like a man who had been living in the vehicle rather than simply driving it home from work. "License and registration, please," Daniel said, stepping back slightly, but his eyes never left Clint. The man hesitated for a moment before fumbling in the glove compartment, handing over the documents with shaky hands. Daniel glanced over them, memorizing the name, Clint Miller. Everything seemed legitimate. Still, that gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach didn't go away. As Daniel handed the papers back, his eyes shifted to the truck's bed. It was an old vehicle, yes, but the tailgate looked unusual. The scratches on the bed seemed out of place, and the dark stain made his gut tighten. Something wasn't right. He casually mentioned the condition of the truck to Clint. "Your truck's seen some rough use," Daniel remarked, his tone nonchalant, though his mind was already piecing things together. Clint simply shrugged, tightening his grip on the wheel. "Yeah, You know how it is. Hauling stuff. Tools banging around. I'm in construction when I'm not at the factory. Daniel nodded, taking in the explanation. But something in the back of his mind was still unsettled. He shifted his flashlight toward the bed of the truck, trying to peer through the narrow gap between the tailgate and the cover. That's when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic banging sound. It was quiet, almost muffled, but unmistakable. Daniel's heart rate increased, his pulse quickening as he instinctively moved his hand closer to his holster. His training told him to be cautious, but every bone in his body screamed that something was wrong. The man's nervousness, the unusual markings on the truck, and now the sounds coming from the bed. Everything was pointing to something much more sinister than a simple stop for a tail light. Without waiting another moment, Daniel's voice was firm as he addressed Clint. Mind popping open the back for me? Clint's face froze for the briefest of moments, before he forced a nervous laugh. What? The bed? It's just tools back there. A real mess. You don't need to open it. Daniel didn't flinch. His tone remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. Open it. Clint hesitated. His eyes narrowed, fingers flexing against the steering wheel. A slight twitch in his hand, as if he were about to make a move, was all the warning Daniel needed. Without warning, Clint slammed the truck's gas pedal to the floor. The tires screeched, sending a cloud of gravel flying as the truck lurched forward, swerving back onto the road. Daniel's instincts kicked in immediately. The man was fleeing. Damn it, Daniel muttered under his breath. He spun on his heel and sprinted back toward his cruiser, adrenaline surging as he dove into the driver's seat. Without wasting a second, he slammed the gear into drive and floored the accelerator, chasing after the truck as it sped down the road. The pursuit was on. The roar of Clint Miller's truck echoed through the night air, its engine growling as the tires screeched against the gravel. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as he reacted instinctively. Without hesitation, he slammed his foot on the accelerator, the police cruiser responding with a jolt, its engine roaring to life as it tore down the road in pursuit. The truck was fast, too fast for a vehicle in such disrepair. Daniel could feel his pulse racing in time with the speed of the chase, the headlights illuminating the twisted path Clint was carving through the darkness. The truck swerved dangerously, tires skidding as it tore across the uneven road. But Clint was determined, his panic clear in the reckless manner in which he drove. The air was thick with tension. Daniel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. His eyes locked on the taillights of the fleeing vehicle as it shot through the bends and curves of the winding road. He was a seasoned officer, but nothing could prepare him for the intense rush of adrenaline that came with a high-speed pursuit. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, and Clint had the advantage of familiarity with the terrain. Daniel's thoughts raced as the truck ahead of him cut across the road, veering toward the shoulder and back again. He had to close the distance, had to stop Clint before this went any further. But the truck was unpredictable, lurching and swerving in erratic directions, as if Clint was trying to outmaneuver him at every turn. Stay calm. Keep your distance, Daniel muttered to himself, though his grip on the wheel was starting to feel like it might slip from his hands. He was right on Clint's tail, but any sudden move could turn this into a dangerous, high-speed crash. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense trees on either side, offering no escape routes for either vehicle. The truck jolted again, bouncing off the uneven surface, and Daniel saw the opportunity. The turn ahead was sharp, a curve that Clint was approaching too fast. He could either cut the corner too tightly or slam into the guardrail. Daniel sped up, calculating the distance and the angle. He was ready. As Clint's truck swung left, the rear end fishtailed dangerously. Daniel didn't hesitate. He edged the cruiser closer, his sirens blaring now, the sound rising and falling as they hurtled toward the curve. Clint's truck struggled to regain control, the back wheels sliding slightly. And in that moment of instability, Daniel made his move. He gunned the engine, closing the gap and positioning himself to the left of Clint's truck. But Clint wasn't backing down. A quick look in his rearview mirror showed a wild desperation in his eyes. And with a sudden jerk of the wheel, Clint attempted to force Daniel off the road. The move was reckless, born from pure panic. He swung the truck back into the lane. But Daniel was ready, keeping his focus, determined not to let the suspect escape. The two vehicles were neck and neck now, pushing the limits of their speed. The lights from Daniel's cruiser flashed in the dark, illuminating the night sky with an almost blinding intensity. Every turn, every shift of the gears, was critical now. If Clint made one wrong move, it could end both of their lives. Ahead, a sign flashed into view, signaling a sharp curve, a dangerous one that could easily end in disaster at this speed. Daniel's mind raced, calculating the outcome. The truck was still too erratic, too fast, and there was no way Clint was going to make the turn safely at this rate. "Come on, just make it through," Daniel whispered to himself, his hand tightening around the wheel. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror for the briefest of moments, scanning the path ahead. The road was about to tighten. This was the moment he had to take action. Clint's truck hit the curve at a reckless angle. The tires screeched as the vehicle slid sideways, the back end swinging out of control. The truck's rear tires caught the edge of the asphalt, sending it into a wild spin. In that instant, Daniel reacted with everything he had. He swerved his cruiser to the right, maneuvering in behind Clint just as the truck lost its balance. With one final attempt to right himself, Clint swerved violently toward the shoulder, his tires grabbing the edge of the dirt. But the weight of the truck proved too much. The vehicle jerked and then crashed, skidding to a stop just inches from the tree line. It was over. Daniel's cruiser came to a halt just behind the wreckage, the sirens still wailing in the otherwise silent night. He threw the vehicle into park, his hands still shaking from the rush. He couldn't afford to relax just yet. The suspect had finally stopped, but it didn't mean he was done. His pulse still thumping in his ears. Daniel reached for his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Dispatch. I need backup. We've got a vehicle in a ditch. Suspect is at a standstill." His breath came in short bursts, his mind still processing the high-speed chase. But now he had a new priority: the truck in front of him, the risk of what Clint might be hiding in there. With a deep breath, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and prepared to approach the wreckage. He didn't know what he would find, but he had a sinking feeling that the real danger was just beginning. As Daniel approached the wrecked truck, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his chest. The adrenaline from the high-speed pursuit had begun to ebb, but the tension in the air was palpable. His flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the crumpled front end of Clint Miller's vehicle, which had come to a halt mere inches from a line of trees. The truck's engine sputtered, steam rising from the hood, while the tires spun lazily in place. The suspect was motionless behind the wheel, his face pale and contorted from the force of the crash. Clint had stopped, but Daniel wasn't fooled. He knew better than to assume the situation was under control. His training kicked in as he approached the truck cautiously, his eyes darting around the immediate surroundings for any signs of danger. Every step was calculated, each one bringing him closer to an unknown threat. "Clint Miller, step out of the vehicle. Now," Daniel shouted, his voice firm, but there was no response. The truck remained eerily still, the only sound the occasional hiss of steam escaping from the engine. Daniel knew Clint was likely in a state of shock, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. His hand hovered near his holster, ready for any sudden movement from the suspect. He moved slowly, keeping his focus on the truck as he reached the driver's side. The door was crumpled inwards, but it was still functional. With a sharp tug, Daniel pulled the door open, the metal groaning in protest. The suspect was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. Daniel's eyes quickly scanned the interior, noting the disarray, the torn fabric of the seats, the scattered papers, and the spilled contents of a duffel bag. But it was what he saw in the back seat that sent a cold shiver down his spine. A small hand, pale and fragile, hung over the edge of the seat, the fingers twitching as though reaching for something or someone. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he leaned in closer, the beam of his flashlight revealing the source of the movement: a child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, curled up in the back seat, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her clothes were torn, and her hair was matted, but it was the wide, frightened eyes that held Daniel's gaze. "Hey," It's okay, Daniel murmured gently, kneeling beside the truck as he cautiously reached for the little girl's hand. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't pull away. He could see the fear in her eyes, the deep, overwhelming terror that told him everything he needed to know about what she had just endured. She was scared, confused, and alone. Stay calm. I'm here to help you, Daniel said, trying to soothe her as he gently unbuckled the seatbelt that had been keeping her in place. She flinched, but didn't resist, her small body stiff with fear. Her clothes, once bright and clean, were now stained with dirt and grime, and her face showed signs of distress, bruises, scrapes, and the faintest hint of tears. This wasn't just a child caught in an accident. This was a child who had been through something horrific. As he carefully lifted her out of the truck, Daniel's thoughts raced. This was no ordinary case of a runaway or an abandoned child. This little girl had been taken, held against her will, and the fact that she was in Clint Miller's truck, of all people, meant that the situation was far more sinister than it appeared at first glance. The child clung to him weakly, her small body trembling in his arms as he carried her away from the wreckage, her face buried in his shoulder. Her sobs were muffled, but Daniel could feel the weight of her grief. He knew he couldn't let her go, not until he understood exactly what had happened. "Hang on," he whispered, trying to calm her down as he moved toward the cruiser. "You're safe now." The moment he reached the police vehicle, Daniel glanced over his shoulder at the wrecked truck one last time. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Clint Miller had been fleeing for a reason, and that reason had everything to do with the child he had been transporting. But what had led to her abduction? What had Clint been hiding? And how long had she been trapped in that truck? As he placed the little girl into the back of his cruiser, Daniel's eyes locked onto the wreckage again. The night had taken a dark turn, one that would lead him down a road full of difficult questions and dangerous answers. This wasn't just a case of a suspect on the run. This was the beginning of a much deeper investigation, one that would uncover the horrifying truth about the kidnapping and the lengths Clint Miller had gone to in order to keep his secret hidden. The child's grip tightened around his fingers, and Daniel's resolve hardened. He couldn't let her down. Not now. Not ever. He was going to find out exactly what had happened to her, and he wasn't going to rest until Clint Miller faced the full consequences of his actions. The sirens of the police cruiser had long since faded into the distance, but the weight of the night's events still hung heavy in the air. Daniel sat in his patrol car, his fingers tapping nervously against the steering wheel. The little girl, now wrapped in a blanket and sitting quietly in the back of his vehicle, had fallen into a deep sleep, her small body exhausted from the trauma of the past few hours. Daniel, however, could not afford the luxury of rest. The wreckage of Clint Miller's truck sat on the side of the road, now cordoned off by fellow officers. The forensic team had arrived, and yellow tape fluttered in the wind, signaling the start of what promised to be a thorough investigation. Daniel knew that the next few hours would be crucial. He had to gather every piece of information he could before the case slipped from his grasp. With the child safely in protective custody, Daniel's thoughts turned to the details of the abduction. What had led Clint Miller to take this child? Was she a random victim? Or was there a deeper connection? Daniel's mind raced, and he knew that the answers to these questions lay in the wrecked truck and in the man who had been driving it. But Clint Miller was still unconscious, and the answers he sought would not come easily. The first step was to gather evidence from the scene. Daniel stepped out of his vehicle, the cool night air biting at his skin as he approached the wreckage. The forensic team was already hard at work, carefully collecting evidence from the truck and the surrounding area. Every item in the vehicle, every scrap of paper, every piece of fabric, held the potential to shed light on the events leading up to the crash. One of the officers approached Daniel with a folder in hand. "We've found something you'll want to see," the officer said, his voice low and serious. "There's a receipt in the glove compartment. It's from a store about an hour away, and it lists some unusual items, enough to raise some red flags." Daniel's brow furrowed as he took the folder. He flipped through the documents, his eyes scanning the contents. The receipt was dated earlier that day and showed a purchase of multiple items, some standard, like canned goods and bottled water. But there were other items that stood out: duct tape, rope, and a large tarp. Daniel's instincts told him that these were not the kinds of items anyone would buy for a simple road trip. They spoke to something far more sinister. "Keep going," Daniel urged, his voice sharp. "What else did you find?" The officer hesitated for a moment, then continued. "There's also a map, folded up in the back seat. It's marked with several locations, but none of them are anywhere near here. They seem to be along the outskirts of the city, in some remote areas." Daniel's heart began to race as he processed the information. The items Clint had purchased, combined with the marked map, suggested premeditation. This wasn't a random abduction. Whoever Clint Miller had been working for, or with, had a plan. A plan that had involved more than just taking a child. "What about the kid?" Daniel asked, turning his attention back to the girl in the back of his cruiser. "We've spoken to her briefly," the officer replied, his tone sympathetic. "She's in shock, but she's starting to open up. We don't have much from her yet, but she mentioned something about a man named Frank before she went quiet again. It might be another lead." Daniel's mind raced. A name, Frank. It could be the key to everything. But how much could he trust the words of a traumatized child? She was young, confused, and likely scared. But there had to be some truth in what she said, something to lead them further down this dark path. "Bring her in for questioning as soon as she's stable," Daniel said, his voice firm. "And let's get a sketch artist on the phone. I want to know everything she can remember about Frank." As the officers continued to comb through the truck, Daniel turned back to the wreckage. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, noting the faint tire tracks leading away from the crash site. There were no other vehicles in sight, no obvious signs of anyone else involved in the crash. It seemed as though Clint Miller had been alone when the truck went off the road, but that didn't mean he had been working alone. It was time to widen the investigation. Clint Miller had a history, and Daniel intended to dig into it. He pulled out his phone and dialed the department's criminal records unit. "Get me everything on Clint Miller," he instructed. "I want to know who he's been connected to, who he's worked with, and any known associates. We need to understand who we're dealing with." As the hours ticked by, Daniel's mind was consumed by one question. What was Clint Miller's role in all of this? Was he the mastermind behind the abduction, or just a pawn in a larger game? And who was Frank, the name that the child had mentioned? The investigation was still in its early stages, but already, Daniel knew one thing for certain. This case was far from ordinary. There were deeper layers to uncover, secrets to unravel, and a dangerous path ahead. He couldn't stop now, not when the answers were just within reach. The clock was ticking. Every passing minute felt like an eternity as Daniel stood in the cramped room at the precinct, surrounded by maps, files, and a growing sense of urgency. The kidnapper had been driving recklessly, but that didn't mean they weren't still out there. Still a threat. The child's safety, Clint Miller's true motives, and the looming danger were all entangled in a web that was growing tighter by the second. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the map pinned to the wall, his finger tracing the various locations marked with XS. The officer who had found the map in Miller's truck had been right. Each marked location was deep in the outskirts, in areas where few people ever ventured. The locations were isolated and remote, hidden from the public eye, but they were no less important now. Daniel knew this was where they had to focus their search. If the child was to be found in time, it would be in one of those places. He turned to his team, each officer focused, their faces drawn with the same intensity. They had all been on edge since the abduction was reported, but now the pressure was on. Time was the most critical factor. They couldn't afford to lose even a minute. The abductor was no longer just a threat to the child. He had become a ticking bomb, capable of disappearing into the vast wilderness of the city's outskirts at any moment. "We're going to split into 3 teams," Daniel said, his voice unwavering. "Team 1 will head out to the northern locations. Team 2 will cover the westernmost points. And Team 3 will focus on this area here." He pointed to a section marked with an X near the edge of the city. "We'll have backup in place in case we need to move fast." He quickly outlined the plan, assigning the teams their respective zones. It was crucial that they remained in constant contact, that they kept their radios open and shared any findings instantly. Every detail counted now. If they could even find the slightest trace of the abductor, it could lead them to the child. As the teams gathered their gear and prepared to leave, Daniel's phone rang. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the caller ID. It was the department's criminal records unit. He answered quickly, trying to keep his thoughts focused. "Daniel, we've pulled up Clint Miller's file," the voice on the other end said. "He's been in and out of jail for the past decade. Theft, assault, and a few drug-related charges. But here's the interesting part. We've got records showing connections to a man named Frank Slater. Slater's been linked to a network of human traffickers." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Human trafficking. The abduction suddenly felt even darker than it had before. His mind raced. Was the child being taken for something more sinister than just a ransom? And who was Frank Slater in all of this? "Where is Slater now?" Daniel asked, his voice barely masking the urgency. "We don't know yet. His last known whereabouts were a few months ago, but we're digging deeper. We'll let you know if we find anything new. Keep me updated," Daniel said quickly before hanging up. He felt a new surge of anxiety. Frank Slater was likely involved, and the child wasn't just a victim of an abduction. She might be part of something much larger. Daniel was no longer just chasing a criminal. He was hunting a predator, someone who had the power to change lives forever. Teams 1 and 2, get moving, Daniel ordered, his mind already working through the next steps. "We need to move fast. We're not just looking for Clint Miller anymore. We're looking for someone who knows how to vanish." The teams dispersed, racing into the night with one goal in mind: find the child before it was too late. The landscape was dark and dangerous, filled with thick woods and abandoned buildings that could easily conceal anything. Time wasn't just a factor. It was the difference between life and death. Daniel's stomach twisted with the thought of how quickly things could escalate. His eyes flicked back to the map. His team was already heading toward their assigned zone. He stood for a moment, trying to center himself, but the words "human trafficking" echoed in his mind, growing louder and louder. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. He picked it up, hoping for some breakthrough in the investigation. "Detective?" The voice was breathless. "We've got a hit. We found a vehicle matching Miller's truck heading toward one of the marked locations. We've got patrols on the way." The news sent a jolt of adrenaline through Daniel's veins. This was it. This was the break they needed. The vehicle had been spotted, and they were closing in. "Don't lose him," Daniel ordered firmly. "We need to be there first. Hold your position and wait for backup." As his team began racing toward the location, Daniel could feel the weight of time bearing down on him. Every second mattered. Every second could bring them closer to finding the child, or losing her forever. There was no more room for hesitation. There was no more room for error. This was the race against time, and Daniel wasn't about to let it slip away. The sound of engines revving echoed through the quiet streets as Daniel's team approached the warehouse, a sprawling, industrial complex at the edge of town. The location had been identified as the likely hideout for Clint Miller and his accomplices, and intelligence gathered earlier confirmed it as a hub for illicit activity. A shadow of dread loomed over Daniel as he glanced out the window of the armored vehicle, his thoughts racing. This was it, the endgame. The operation had been meticulously planned. Backup units from the local SWAT team had already arrived, ready for the raid. The air was thick with anticipation, each officer silently preparing for the confrontation that was about to unfold. There was no room for error now. Time was running out, and every minute spent waiting could mean the difference between saving the child and losing her forever. Daniel's heart pounded as he received the go-ahead signal from the operation commander. "We move now," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency he felt. The vehicle skidded to a halt just outside the warehouse. Officers moved swiftly, forming a perimeter as others took positions at the front. The plan was simple: storm the building, neutralize the suspects, and secure the child. But the complexity of the mission was anything but simple. They had no idea what awaited them inside. Clint Miller was dangerous, and the people he was working with were just as ruthless. The tension was palpable. The command was given: "Go!" The sound of boots pounding against the ground was drowned out by the deafening crash of battering rams slamming into the doors of the warehouse. In an instant, The officers breached the entrance. Flashbangs exploded in rapid succession, disorienting anyone inside. The warehouse went from silence to chaos in the blink of an eye. The heavy scent of dust and oil mixed with the acrid smoke from the flashbangs, and officers rushed inside, weapons drawn. Daniel moved with his team, clearing rooms methodically. He'd done this many times before, but each raid still carried the same weight. As they made their way deeper into the warehouse, the sound of muffled cries reached his ears. His stomach tightened. The victims were here, and they were alive. "Get down!" Daniel shouted as they encountered two armed men at the far end of the warehouse. Shots rang out, echoing through the vast space. Daniel ducked behind a stack of crates, his team providing cover fire. The gunmen were fast, but the SWAT team was faster, swiftly neutralizing the threat. "Clear!" came the shout from the front of the warehouse. They advanced, their steps cautious but determined. The cries grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one child, there were more. His mind raced as he thought of the horrors these children must have endured. But now, they were closer to freedom than they had ever been. Daniel entered a small, dimly lit room off the main floor. There, in the corner, huddled a group of children, no more than 4 or 5, dirty and frightened, their wide eyes filled with terror. One of them, a young girl with dark hair and tear-streaked cheeks, was clutching a ragged doll. The sight shattered something deep within Daniel, and he felt his breath catch in his throat. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently, lowering his weapon and taking a cautious step forward. "You're safe now. We're here to help." The children stared at him, unsure, their fear still overwhelming. Daniel motioned to one of the officers behind him, signaling them to provide reassurance. As the officer moved in, gently talking to the children, Daniel quickly assessed the rest of the room. There were cages, metal, rusted, and cold, strewn across the floor. Some were empty, but others held signs of abuse, discarded blankets, clothing, and remnants of meals long past. A sickening realization washed over him. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was organized trafficking. These children had been taken from their homes, hidden away, and prepared for a life of unimaginable suffering. The magnitude of the operation was clearer now, and Daniel felt a surge of anger. They had stopped it, but it was only a small victory in a larger war. "Sir, we've got another one," a voice from the doorway called. Daniel turned to see an officer holding a young boy, no older than 8, who appeared to be in shock. Without a second thought, Daniel moved to take the child, gently lifting him into his arms. The boy didn't resist, but his wide, unblinking eyes seemed lost, disconnected from reality. The trauma they'd all endured was far deeper than anyone could comprehend. "Get them out of here," Daniel ordered, his voice firm. "Get them to safety. We need medical attention. Now." As the children were escorted out of the warehouse, Daniel's heart still raced. But there was no time for a moment of relief. Clint Miller was still at large, and the rest of the operation was far from over. The warehouse had yielded crucial evidence, but the leader of this operation, the man behind the nightmare, was still out there. Daniel moved through the warehouse with a new sense of urgency. Every room, every corner needed to be checked. The criminals who ran this operation couldn't be allowed to escape. They couldn't be allowed to hurt another child. His radio crackled. "Detective, we found something." The voice was tense, filled with the weight of what was to come. Daniel's hand tightened around his weapon as he moved toward the new lead. The raid was far from finished. This was just the beginning of the fight to dismantle a network of horror and give these children the chance to heal. As the dust settled from the raid, Daniel and his team stood amidst the wreckage of the warehouse, their thoughts racing. The children were safely in the hands of medical professionals. But the mission wasn't over. The most critical piece of the puzzle remained: the criminal organization that had orchestrated this trafficking ring. Their reach extended far beyond this warehouse, and the true scope of their operations was still a mystery. The team worked relentlessly to gather evidence from the scene. Officers were documenting every corner of the warehouse, collecting fingerprints, DNA samples, and anything else that could be linked back to the criminals. Daniel walked through the darkened space, his eyes scanning for clues. the metal cages, the discarded clothing, the remnants of food. Each spoke of the horrors these children had endured, but they were only the beginning. In one of the back rooms, hidden behind a stack of crates, Daniel found a file tucked into a dusty drawer. It was a thick folder, marked with symbols Daniel immediately recognized from previous cases involving human trafficking. His pulse quickened as he flipped through the pages. The contents were disturbing, to say the least. Lists of names, coded messages, and references to locations across the country. There was no doubt in his mind now. This was a well-organized syndicate with far-reaching connections. As he scanned the pages, one name stood out. Clint Miller's name appeared repeatedly, linked with a variety of aliases and accomplices. But there was another name as well, a name that sent a chill down his spine: Victor Graves. This name was tied to multiple locations, some of which Daniel knew were connected to powerful criminal enterprises. Victor Graves was more than just a trafficker. He was a mastermind, a leader of a network that stretched its claws into every corner of the underground world. Daniel's mind raced. If Victor Graves was involved, this was no ordinary trafficking ring. It was a sophisticated operation with resources and connections that could make it nearly impossible to dismantle. But Daniel wasn't one to back down. He had seen too much suffering to let this continue. He called in the team leader. "Captain Harris, we need to bring in the intelligence unit. This is bigger than we thought. We've got a name, Victor Graves. And this isn't just a local operation. These people are connected to international trafficking rings." Harris nodded grimly. "Get me everything you've got. We'll need all hands on deck for this one." As the team sifted through the evidence, they uncovered more details that sent the investigation into overdrive. Documents outlined the methods of recruitment. Victims were often lured through promises of work or a better life. They were then transported across state lines, sometimes even out of the country, and forced into the most unimaginable circumstances. The operation's scope was horrifying, and the impact on the victims was profound. Some of the names listed were of missing persons from cities far and wide, linking this crime syndicate to an even larger web of deceit and exploitation. Daniel knew they needed more than just names. They needed concrete evidence to take down the entire operation and bring those responsible to justice. The warehouse was only the first domino to fall. The real work was just beginning. As hours turned into days, the investigation intensified. Intelligence reports poured in, revealing the vastness of the network. Victor Graves, it seemed, was a key figure in a global trade. The trafficking ring was linked to other criminal activities, including drug smuggling, weapons trade, and even money laundering. The more Daniel learned, the more horrified he became. This was not just about saving children. It was about unraveling a criminal empire that had infiltrated multiple industries. The team worked tirelessly, following every lead, chasing down every connection. Surveillance footage from the warehouse revealed more suspects, some of them known criminals, others seemingly average individuals who had been recruited into the operation. But the real breakthrough came when they tracked down a series of encrypted emails tied to Victor Graves. Using a specialized team of cyber analysts, they were able to decrypt the messages, uncovering a treasure trove of information about the organization's operations. One of the messages contained details about an upcoming shipment of children, an operation planned to move victims from the warehouse to a larger facility in a neighboring state. The shipment was scheduled to take place in less than a week. This was the opportunity Daniel and his team had been waiting for. They could not afford to wait any longer. The lives of countless children were at stake. "We have a window," Daniel said to Harris, his voice resolute. "We need to act fast. We've got intel on another facility. It's time to take them down." The information they had gathered painted a terrifying picture. The trafficking ring was far more powerful and far-reaching than anyone had anticipated. But Daniel's resolve only hardened. This wasn't just a job, it was a mission. He couldn't let this network continue to operate, knowing the devastation it caused in its wake. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this operation would require more than just police work. It would take cooperation from federal agencies, international law enforcement, and countless resources. But Daniel was ready. This was his fight now. and he would do whatever it took to uncover the full truth about the crime organization and bring it down once and for all. The hours dragged on as Daniel and his team meticulously pieced together the final elements of the investigation. Each piece of evidence, every lead, had pointed them toward a singular truth. The crime syndicate they were hunting was larger and more sophisticated than anyone could have imagined. What had started as a mission to rescue a single child had grown into an international operation that spanned multiple continents and industries. The victims were not just numbers on a page. They were real children, real people whose lives had been shattered by the greed of those in power. As the final raid unfolded and the last of the perpetrators were apprehended, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on the journey. He had seen the worst humanity had to offer in the faces of the criminals they had taken down. But he had also seen the best in the courage of the children who had fought to survive and the unwavering dedication of his team. They had all given everything to ensure that justice was served. The operation to dismantle the trafficking ring was not just a victory for law enforcement. It was a triumph for those who had suffered in silence for far too long. The children who had once been held in the dark corners of warehouses and hidden away in the shadows of society were now free. Their futures no longer defined by the horrors they had endured. But while the physical chains were broken, the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. For many of these children, the road ahead would be long, filled with therapy, recovery, and rebuilding their lives. But for the first time, they had hope. Justice had been served, but the fight was far from over. As the last criminal was led away in handcuffs, Daniel's phone rang. It was a call from Captain Harris, who was overseeing the final stages of the operation. "We've got it," Harris said, his voice filled with relief. "The rest of the syndicate is falling apart. We've got enough evidence to send this entire network to the courts, and the authorities are already reaching out to their international counterparts to track down those still on the run. We're taking this down, piece by piece." Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The case was far from over, but the most dangerous part had been conquered. The truth about the syndicate would be exposed to the world, and those responsible for the suffering of so many would face justice. This victory was hard-earned, but it was worth every sacrifice. Despite the satisfaction of seeing justice served, Daniel knew that the world of human trafficking was far from over. As long as there were people willing to exploit the vulnerable, there would always be a need for those who would stand against such evil. And the truth was, this fight would never truly end. As new cases emerged, as new victims were discovered, Daniel and his team would continue the battle, unwavering in their commitment to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The press conference held shortly after the operation's conclusion marked the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of another. The public was informed about the scale of the trafficking ring, the arrests made, and the steps that would be taken to ensure that such a network could never rise again. But Daniel wasn't concerned with the applause or recognition. His mind was already focused on the future, on those who had been saved and those who were still out there, waiting to be found. In the end, justice wasn't just about bringing criminals to trial. It was about giving victims a voice, restoring their dignity, and ensuring that they were no longer forgotten. The children they had rescued were not just numbers, they were survivors, and their lives mattered. Daniel would continue to fight for them, for the innocent lives that had been stolen, and for the countless others who still needed a hero to step forward and stand in their defense. The road to justice had been long, but it had been worth it. And as Daniel looked out over the city, the sun rising in the distance, he knew that the work was far from done. There were more battles to fight, more lives to save, and more criminals to bring to justice. But he was ready. They all were.